Okay, 2 minutes to go. And here we go, 11:30 sharp. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 6th chamber talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is Sultan Hatoum from Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'm honored to be moderating the Chamber Talk 23 webinars, which will be covering a wide spectrum of hot topics until the end of August. If you didn't get the chance to join us on our Sunday session with Deloitte on crisis management and key considerations of getting back to business, please visit our YouTube channel and Facebook page for the and to watch all of Chamber Talk previous conducted webinars. We are glad to offer you Chamber Talk sessions in both English and Arabic simultaneously. You can join the Arabic session on the link shared in the chat box. Today's session is a bit different, as it will be tackling a specific sector, a sector that touches every home and concerns everyone, education. After our roads were jammed with school buses, schools crowded with students, and teachers thrilled in building the next generation, suddenly everything paused and the world turned around. Roads went empty, students got locked at homes, and teachers stepped aside for parents to take the lead. There is no doubt that the impact of this unfortunate pandemic has shifted priorities of some governments and investments into sectors of instant concern. However, education must remain a core sector of focus, especially in such times, as countries who invest in continuous education, productivity, and skills step out stronger. And that's what we have experienced in the UAE, with a diversified and flexible knowledge-based economy that was set as a core theme for UAE Vision 2021. A whole country, in just a matter of few weeks, were able to adapt to the new norm, turn the engines on, and started with distance learning and remote at a broad scale. A large and for those who weren't, they found all the support needed from the Ministry of Education and the government. As it is the case in all new matters, the experience with distance learning weren't the same among all stakeholders, and it had its pros and cons on different aspects. However, the question remains, how are we proceeding to the future? Is it gonna be the new norm with a permanent hybrid or blended approach? Or life will get back to normal with the old conventional approach? And if we'll experience a shift in the existing operating models, should we expect adjustments to related policies? As a final point, whether it is an e-learning or not, education remains a lifelong journey. It is about continuous investment in knowledge and anticipation of required skills to maintain competitiveness and be ready to push the economy forward in the short, medium, and long term. This sets the stage for our topic for the day, education as an enabler of economic activity in the context of COVID-19, which will be discussed by the experts in the field, Anna Grotberg and Beatrice Cernuta from EY-Parthenon. Our speakers come with extensive knowledge and experience in the education sector, especially that they got the privilege to work in both the industry and the consultancy worlds. Anna is an associate partner in EY-Parthenon's education practice based in London, working with investors on commercial due diligence and operators on growth and operating strategies. Prior to EY-Parthenon, Anna served as a policy analyst to the Michael Gove, Member Parliament and former Secretary of State for Education, and was the Annenberg Fellow at Eton College. Our second speaker, Beatrice Cernuta, is a director at EY-Parthenon's education practice based in Dubai. She has extensive experience working in and draws from her experience working in the UK, India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Prior to rejoining EY-Parthenon, Beatrice spent 4 years as a director of strategy and operations at Tarbiya, a Dubai-based education company. In addition to establishing joint ventures with international education partners, Beatrice has also successfully set up and opened the first special needs center of its kind in MENA, as well as a K-12 school. We're all excited to start, so I'll pass it to the ladies to take over.
Thank you very much, Sultan. I hope you can all hear me, and good morning, everyone who's joined us for this session, and really thank you for making the time to be here with us today. Before we start, just a couple of additional words about us and our work. Parthenon is the strategy consulting unit within EY, and our education practice that Sultan already mentioned is unique in its kind. We complete over 300 projects every year exclusively in education. And overall, we have completed over 2,000 projects in over 95 countries, exclusively in the education sector. And we work extensively in the GCC region, including the UAE, where we support government entities, operators, as well as investors in the education sector. As part of the multiple conversations that we have been having with our clients and contacts in the region, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly been at the forefront of our minds and on everybody's minds. This map gives you a quick snapshot of the impact of COVID-19 on the education sector from a global perspective. At its peak, over 1.6 billion learners were affected by the shutdowns that related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this represented around 90% of all learners globally. If you look at the map, the grey areas are countries that faced a complete countrywide shutdown of the education systems. Countries in light blue, such as the United States and China, are countries that faced a partial shutdown. And you can see in dark blue are countries that either didn't close the school systems, very few, as you can see, or countries that had pretty soon started reopening the schools and their education systems. What we imagine is that in the next few weeks, this map will change pretty fast, but also that some countries will switch, unfortunately, these colors back and forth. A very specific example for those of you who may have been following the news is that Beijing, for example, in China specifically, had reopened its schools as part of a nationwide reopening, but then in fears of a second wave, actually has now closed its schools again. So we'll all be pretty tuned into this map and we'll definitely see several changes in the weeks to come. If we maintain the international picture, but is really zoomed into the effects of the macro landscape onto specific stakeholders, we really want to talk about how different entities have been affected by the pandemic and how different individuals have been reacting to the changes. First, let's talk about students and parents. And I'm sure that for many of you on the webinar, this is a reality that you are extremely familiar with in your homes on a daily basis. Students' learning, of course, has been disrupted by the shutdown of educational institutions, and students have had to adapt their ways of learning to remote methods, including tools such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And of course, there's been disruption around significant milestones for students, such as exams, but also enrollment into universities for September, all of which is still a little bit up in the air. And parents, of course, have had to reinvent themselves in a way, not just as potentially sort of employees in a new remote working environment, but also as educators at home. And of course, this has happened in a climate of often limited time, limited resources, and also limited training that parents would have in sort of doubling up as educators. And of course, this is also starting to change the mindset of parents who have historically chosen private education for their children, making parents really question sort of the fees they are paying and the value for money they are getting from operators in terms of education. What does this mean for the private sector? And I'm now looking at the right-hand side of this page. Specific education providers, and what I mean by education providers is nurseries, schools, universities, and chains of the same. All of them obviously have had to adapt to remote learning, pretty quickly invest in technologies and training educators. And institutions have also had to find new ways of really staying close to the parent community and the student community and communicate in this new environment. In this climate, there's also been significant difficulties around funding and liquidity. There's been a slowdown for education institutions around cash collections. Some parents and families may have faced difficulties due to potential job losses or pay freezes around paying for tuition fees. And in general, there may be a reluctance in sort of paying upfront fees because of what I mentioned before around a change in perception in terms of value for money. And operators have also had to potentially put on hold expansion plans, whilst at the same time really dealing with them pretty challenging operational matters. For example, securing enrollments for the next academic years has been difficult because parents and students haven't been able to do school tours or campus tours of universities. Of course, there are challenges about recruiting new educators as well, especially when it comes to visa restrictions and travel bans. And finally, education institutions are really still trying to get their minds around how to deal with health and safety requirements once physical settings actually reopen. As many of you know, I'm sure, several private education providers are actually backed by investors. This could be family offices, it could be private equity firms. Internationally, this is also pension funds. And these investors as well, of course, have been impacted by changes within the portfolio companies. Investors have had to really rethink what future performance would look like for the education portfolio companies and think about sustainability of growth drivers. And of course, even the plans for new investments in the sectors have had to be put either on hold or be rethought. Investors are starting to see opportunities. This is either around potential distressed sales of education assets, or even the desire to really look at education technology as an investment area. So shifts are starting to happen, but fundamentally, of course, some challenges remain. What does this mean specifically for Abu Dhabi? And before we talk about the impact of the pandemic, it's probably worth setting the lay of the land for those of you who might not be familiar with the details of this sector. The Ministry of Education in the UAE looks at education from a federal level. And then, of course, in Abu Dhabi specifically, the Abu Dhabi Department for Education and Knowledge, also known as ADEC, looks after matters specifically within Abu Dhabi. Now, if we look at the left-hand side of this page, there is one key message that we really wanted to highlight here. The private sector plays an important part in the delivery of education in Abu Dhabi. This is particularly true for schools labeled here as K-12, so kindergarten to grade 12 settings. Over 60% of enrollments in Abu Dhabi are in fact in private schools. And this percentage is smaller, is around 30% for higher education institutions. But we're still talking about a market that is over $2 billion in size. So this is actually a significant economic sector within the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. It's also worth remembering that nurseries, so pre-K settings, as well as ancillary education services such as tuition providers or lifelong training providers are also fundamentally driven by private sector. So there's an additional contribution that really the private sector makes in Abu Dhabi to education. Now, obviously, COVID-19 has had its impact in Abu Dhabi as well. And as Sultan mentioned in his introduction, the government in Abu Dhabi has been incredibly prompt to respond to the pandemic at its onset. And first of all, of course, as you all know, remote learning kicked in. And really a significant amount of support has come from government authority to really enable the continuation of learning with as little disruption as possible. Some specific initiatives put in place by the government have been outstanding. Some educator training has been put in place in collaboration with partners such as Microsoft. Access to devices as well as software such as LF education has also been pioneered by the government. And then, very importantly, a relief fund was put in place to ensure that families that may have struggled to pay for private school and tuition fees were actually able to continue their children's education. Now, I don't know if you have followed the news late last night, so this didn't make it onto our slides, but there was actually an announcement in the news around the fact that education institutions will be reopening physically, but with some pretty strict parameters in place, and limiting capacity of education institutions and of classrooms in particular is one of the parameters that the government has outlined for what September will look like for education institutions. So we will see a reopening, but things will definitely be a little bit different from what they were before. Now, it's important to say that with all this fantastic support that has come into place, operators themselves will, however, continue to face some challenges, and the sector is under pressure. First of all, there will continue to be pressure around enrollments when it comes to September. If there are population shifts, this might affect schools as well as universities. There will certainly be a lot of competition between private operators to try and get as many enrollments as possible and try to really stick to the work they were doing before and continue to either keep enrollment stable or even grow. Second of all, there will be continued questions around fees and discounts. If there is an element of online and remote learning that continues in September, will students and families be happy to pay the full tuition fee, or will they really expect a discount? Now, why is that challenging? Because operators' cost bases actually haven't decreased. The introduction of technology may have actually increased that slightly. So operators are really facing challenges because they want to give discounts to the parent and the student community, but they also need to continue managing the cost base. So finding the balance will certainly be a challenge on their hands. There might be, again, pressures around families or students paying tuition fees late due to financial difficulties. And finally, there will be continued challenges to be faced around retention and recruitment of new talent, especially in the face of visas and travel regulations that might be shifting pretty quickly. What do we think about all this? We think that some operators, especially those that were already on the path to technological development, those will thrive and they will actually come out of this probably stronger with renewed operating models. But there is no doubt that some operators will actually struggle, and the months to come can really be pretty significant in determining who will win and who might not win out of this scenario. One thing that is very important is that we believe that the Abu Dhabi government can continue looking at what other countries are doing to really support this important economic sector. And I'll let my colleague Anna, who's with us today, tell you a little bit more about what other countries are doing to bolster this important economic sector.
Great. Thanks so much, Beatrice, and good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here this morning speaking with Beatrice on what is such an important part of the economy, certainly in Abu Dhabi, but also in so many other countries across the world. You know, it's interesting to see how different governments have responded to help various sectors of the economy stay afloat during a time that is completely unprecedented in the kind of history of economic activity. And I think, the UK and Australia provide a couple of interesting examples in terms of what the government is doing to help education institutions and to help parents. So if we take the UK, the UK overall has put in a lot of measures to protect jobs, to protect the workforce, effectively providing, income to employees, whether they're in the education sector or otherwise, to ensure that they can be employed, even while schools or universities are shut down. So all education institutions in the UK have the same access to the kind of government grants, loans, job retention that the other sectors of the UK economy have. They've also done a few other things. As an example, they have guaranteed to pay tuition fees for universities ahead of the academic year. As you can imagine, universities in particular get usually their payments for students through the loan scheme throughout the year, but also universities have lots of other revenue that usually comes in, renting out their buildings, conferences, summer schools, and this kind of shortfall in immediate cash is a challenge for a number of universities. And so the government has changed the way that they're going to be providing that tuition fee funding to universities to really try to help them. We've also seen, as an example, the government providing extra support to the nursery sector, so to the pre-K sector, and really trying to help the pre-K sector reopen relatively quickly so that people can kind of get back to work, and we'll kind of come on to that economic impact in particular. Australia also has done a number of things really to support both public and private education institutions. So also in Australia, they are providing a childcare subsidy that is supporting the kind of nursery sector. There's an entire relief package to the higher education sector for public universities, but then also to private universities as well. So, governments really see education as critical to not just kind of economic activity and economic output, but also, one of the things that we're really grappling with is we've now will have had, 3 to 6 to 9 months of interrupted learning for children and for university students. And how do we think about this almost lost generation? So supporting the the education activity with the country is critical, not just for the immediate, but then also when we're thinking about the longer term. So these are just some examples. Different countries have approached this differently. Speaking to Beatrice, it sounds like, Abu Dhabi has been really on the front foot, particularly to support parents, and particularly to help people, keep their children enrolled. I think there's probably other things that Abu Dhabi can look to globally that may help to continue the kind of importance of education institutions throughout the country. So thanks, Beatrice. I'll hand it back to you to talk a little bit more about what you're seeing on the ground.
Thanks, Anna. And what we really want to do now is move the conversation onto a second way to really think about how education and the broader economy are related. And this is particularly the topic of productivity and really trying to talk about how remote learning has been affecting parents, not just as educators that we've talked about before, but also as remote employees. One of the things that we have done over the last few weeks is run a parent survey across emerging markets. The results are not published yet, but sort of stay tuned for the results that we'll put out there. But this is a preview of a particular question that we think is extremely interesting. We asked parents how many additional hours have they been spending during sort of the weeks of the pandemic supporting their children's learning and care. And this would probably also include sort of playtime that parents are now sort of putting in looking after their children at home in the context of educational settings closures. And obviously you can see here on the left-hand side, the range is quite wide. But I think it's quite striking that on average, parents say that they are now spending over 2 additional hours with their children than they were doing before the pandemic. And of course, this has implications both on the strain that this has brought onto parents. Of course, not every respondent is a working parent, and of course, a lot of parents may have more flexibility at work than others. But fundamentally, this number is meaningful. What it also may have implied is that the productivity of parents as employees may have been affected over the last few weeks. And if we look retrospectively, this may have well be inevitable, but this is important to keep in mind looking ahead. Some countries, such as Canada, for example, have been really proactive at keeping this topic in mind. And they've really started a nationwide conversation, sort of started by the government, around sort of how can parents as employees be supported to ensure they can really juggle all of the various hats they have to wear in these difficult times. And there are campaigns such as the Invest in Parents Pledge mentioned on this page, which are really groups formed by not-for-profits that share free resources for employers as well as parents around how to create environments that really allow parents to thrive at home as well as in the workplace. As I mentioned before, it looks like in Abu Dhabi, a decision has been made around reopening education settings in September from a physical perspective. However, given that there might be limitations on classroom capacity, we wouldn't be surprised if some education institutions decide to maintain a component of remote learning when settings reopen in September. So this question still applies. And we think it's very important that government entities, as well as employers, really pause and think about how they can support with resources and specific arrangement their sort of employees as parents to make sure that productivity is maintained, as well as well-being of parents, of course. We wanted next to sort of move on to a third lens in terms of how education relates to economies more broadly. And this is the topic of skilling. And Anna is really our expert on this front. So I'll hand it back to her again to tell you a little bit more about this third lens that is very, very important.
Thanks so much, Beatrice. And it's great. We've kind of now talked about education institutions as an important part of the economy. How do we think about helping parents, helping schools, helping nurseries, helping universities continue on? There is also a large part of the kind of global education market, which is focused on adults. And we're talking about employees or people who have recently lost their job, upskilling, reskilling. How do we think about what may happen in terms of job loss and changes to the kind of shape of the global economy? And I think it's a really important topic. And I think it's an important topic, particularly for this group, which is, how do we now need to think about what the shape of our economy is going to look like over the next 3 to 5 years? And what does that mean for the skills that we're going to need to have Do we have them? Do our people have them? If they don't, what are we going to need to do to kind of change that picture? And, you know, this is, I think, a new conversation that people are now having, particularly within the world of education. You know, this slide here, it's you know, when you look at it together, the kind of economic impact of COVID-19 has been substantial. It is certainly not one of the more positive strings of news that I think you probably wake up and you check your kind of news alerts and you see kind of contractions in economy, you see job loss. You know, currently in the UK, as an example, a quarter, 25% of the UK workforce is being supported by the kind of government job scheme at the moment. That slowly is going to come off over the next couple of months, and we'll kind of really understand kind of what unemployment looks like. You know, if you look to the US, you see the kind of, you know, weekly numbers of people signing up to get unemployment benefits increasing. And we already know that there's just certain segments of the economy that are going to look very, very different over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. We know that the way we work is going to change. You know, I was talking to Beatrice the other day, and we're kind of anticipating going back to the office some of the time, but we'll work from home some of the time. So you can kind of see how an economy is just massively affected by the changes that are happening. And it is, I think, you know, incredibly important that then, instead of being, you know, I guess quite glass half full, gosh, there's lots of unemployment, I think we need to be thinking about, all right, well, what can we do? How can we think about this? How can we as employers, we as education institutions, think about our role to help the unemployed, you know, get back into work? So maybe if we go to the next slide, Beatrice, it might be helpful just to talk through how we think about lifelong learning and that kind of skilling. So if we think about how our work is changing, how the workforce is changing, I mean, you know, I know hospitality is an important part of the Emirati economy, and the kind of how hospitality, you're going to interact with people, is going to be very different over the next 6 to 12 months. You know, here in the UK, we're already seeing how businesses are having to adapt the types of skills that people need. And I think it's helpful to think about the kind of journey of lifelong learning. And, you know, I think it's laid out quite nicely here, you know, how we think about, as you go through the kind of world of work and your career, what skills, when do you learn, how do you advance your career, how do you deepen your domain knowledge? And if we just look at kind of what we've outlined, you know, there's kind of that period, you've got young people just starting out, you know, they need to get the right skills to enter the job market. So, you know, what are the right skills for today? Well, gosh, I think logistics and technology, and there's a whole bunch of kind of skills that all of a sudden, you know, we're seeing, you know, shopping online, online delivery, online businesses, you know, webinars, the way we interact virtually. You can kind of see how that skill set is going to continue to need to be in demand, and likely we're going to shift the way that we interact with businesses. So thinking about what those skills are in the market, you know, then we're going to have people who are maybe early career, maybe thinking about changing their job, and they're going to have to think about what's the type of domain knowledge. And by that, I mean, if I'm going to be, you know, the absolute best logistics manager, what do I need to learn further? Is it new technology? Is it a better understanding of how the supply chain moves throughout my business? You can kind of really start to see what are the skills and what is the knowledge kind of required. And then, you know, as people progress in their career, they still need to learn new things. You know, in particular, I think I'm sure we've all been on a number of Zoom calls or webinars, WebEx or Teams. And certainly some of my older colleagues are not as comfortable with the technology. So actually, we've been doing a lot of upskilling on how do you use Teams? How do you use Zoom? And we don't necessarily think about this as education per se, but it is. There's a continuous development of the skills, knowledge, and information that we need to really thrive in our jobs. And we know that those skills are already shifting. So I think it's a really unique moment to think about the future of the economy, the future skills required, and then how you as employers, as education institutions, as government can help to think about and support that kind of shift, which is going to happen. You know, and I think it's exciting because you can see, you know, there are some countries that have always been at the forefront of, let's say, you know, lifelong learning and skills. It's unsurprising that you see Germany, the Nordic countries. This has been a focus. They have a slightly, I would say, different approach to their education system anyways. And you know, Germany in particular has been kind of at the forefront of thinking about continuous upskilling of workforce over time. I think it's exciting for Abu Dhabi in particular because you're very much emerging, and you can see that the government is putting investment into skills. You can see that that you know, you as a group of, you know, employers see the need for that. And so I think it's an exciting time to really think about the future and what are the skills that are going to be required. I also think it's important because this is where, in particular, I think private and public sector really have to come and play together. You know, our experience is that a lot of the training providers that provide upskilling, reskilling, lifelong learning tend to be private training providers. And you know, that is something that, you know, employers have to work very closely with those training providers to make sure that the training providers are providing the right types of skills, knowledge, you know, into existing employees, and also reskilling employees that may be unemployed. And, you know, we're already seeing a number of these types of activities happening across the world. You know, in particular, Australia has already kind of announced a kind of short course scheme where you can sign online. You know, they're subsidized for students. That's in place for the rest of the year. You know, Singapore has already been on the front foot to get people, you know, training allowances so that they can already start to reskill and retrain. You know, it's interesting. Coursera has been rolling out programs for government, and I believe that Abu Dhabi now has access to this, which is quite exciting. And what you're seeing is Coursera or other online course providers, so there's other ones such as Udemy or Udacity, are providing access to governments, to companies. So as an example, EY, I have access to an online course provider that I can log into at any time and take any course that I might want. And I think, you know, looking at both the financial support that government is providing to help people upskill and reskill, and then the innovative models such as giving employees access to online courses and giving the unemployed access to online courses, you know, is an interesting model just to think about that reskilling agenda. You know, it's quite interesting. France has been going through quite a big change to its kind of training system. You know, if you are unemployed, you automatically get a login to a couple of different online course providers to get started. You have your kind of own digital training account that you'll have over the lifetime of yourself as an employee. So, you know, all of a sudden, I think a lot of countries are starting to see how important lifelong learning is, not just from a kind of continuous improvement standpoint, but actually as we see these tectonic shifts in our economy and in the skills that were required, it's going to be this kind of constant collaboration between the private sector employers, government, and training providers to find what's the right model, what's the right mechanism, and how do we ensure that we are ready for kind of the new economic world that we're entering into. And I think at this stage, I'll pass it back to Beatrice.
Thanks a lot, Anna. And this takes us to just a quick summary before we wrap up of really the three pillars we've looked at today in terms of how education and learning can really be enablers of economic activity and economic success. First of all, we outline how education is an absolutely fundamental economic sector in particular in the context of Abu Dhabi, with sort of a market size of over 2 billion, and obviously several thousands of people employed in this industry. A lot of support has been provided to the sector, to institutions as well as parents, but challenges will remain for operators after the summer. And so we think that it's very important that Abu Dhabi keeps looking at what's happening in other countries and see if there are ways through which this important economic sector can be bolstered. Second of all, we looked at parents as employees and what this means for well-being as well as productivity. And whilst sort of a sort of phase of challenge and potential decrease in productivity may have been inevitable so far, we think that this is really an important time both for government entities as well as for individual employers to really think about what can they do in terms of putting in place and sharing resources as well as arrangements that are mindful of the challenges that parents as employees are facing, and therefore sort of potentially sort of support remote working post-September, and if remote learning continues to an extent, making that a slightly more sustainable system. And then finally, sort of we looked at education as an important area to invest in right now, because ensuring that both government entities as well as individual corporates and employers think about the skills that are most in need right now over the next year and then into the new medium and long term is extremely important. And putting in place various kinds of skilling, upskilling and reskilling programs is actually going to be a very important thing to do. It might obviously at this point in time sort of appear to be, potentially something that takes up some time or takes up some cost. And so there might be sort of a little bit of hesitation around making this investment, but we might be biased because this is the sector that we obviously operate in, but we fundamentally believe that making an investment in skills right now is going to be the right investment to make to ensure that specific companies as well as Abu Dhabi as a whole can really sort of go through the next few months and years sort of on the right foot with a real potential not just to sort of limit effects of the pandemic, but also really continue and accelerate on the success journey that it's really always been on. So before we move on to a sort of Q&A session, for which I think we have a little bit of time, I wanted to first of all thank Sultan and his team for putting this session in place, and also really to the entire Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce. We think that this dialogue between sort of public sector, private sector, service providers is absolutely fundamental. We're humbled to be part of this conversation and this dialogue. So a sincere thank you for this opportunity, and again to all of you. We have a website which you can see on this page at the very bottom on the kind of gray line. And please do take a look at our website, and we have a section which actually includes all of the pieces of thought leadership about sort of the pandemic, but also the impact on the education sector. We have a few pieces specifically on education out there. So please do take a look in your own time. And if you want to reach out to Anna or myself sort of offline, we'd be absolutely delighted to keep talking to all of you. Sultan, back to you now, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Yeah, we do. Just on time, 12:15, so we still have 15 to 16 minutes of Q&A. We've received quite a good number of questions. I will start with a question from Ola, and she's saying, what is the future of extracurricular activities for kids?
All right, thank you very much, Ola, for that question. It's a great question because when we speak to education providers, that is the one thing that is really top of their mind in terms of what they are not able to provide to kids right now. And so what they're telling us is, you know, after a few weeks of, to be honest, chaos, we've now managed to get our house in order when it comes to lesson provision, right? And assessment and homework and communication to parents. But that additional element of in-person interactions and that huge amount of learning that happens outside of the classroom. It's the learning that happens, you know, on the school trip, on the sort of football pitch, in the tennis court, or just frankly over lunch, you know, when sort of kids interact and grow. All of that is missing right now. And I think that that's been one of the biggest drivers behind why, from what we've heard, education institutions were really keen to see at least partial campus reopenings in September, and it looks like that will happen. I think that because of all of that, extracurricular activities as we saw them before will continue and restart, obviously with limitations in place around distancing and potentially masks and sort of anything that comes around health and safety. But fundamentally, those activities, to the extent permitted, will restart because operators as well as families can't wait for that to happen again. But at the same time, we do think that there will be a bigger uptake of distance and remote extracurricular activities. And those can be in particular online courses around, for example, coding. So coding academies have really seen their uptake go up in the last few weeks, as well as other online courses that kids as well as lifelong learners can take. It could be around hobbies, or it could be around sort of specific skills, you know, presentation skills or negotiation skills. So we'll go back to physical extracurricular activities with limitations, but we do fundamentally believe that new extracurricular activities delivered online will also keep growing over the next few weeks.
Thanks, Beatrice. There is a question which I have to take no matter what, because it's from the missus.
Okay.
How can parents get the courage to send their kids to school while COVID probably is still there? In spite of the parameters taken from schools, how kids can get the knowledge to protect themselves, especially if they are in early ages?
Yeah, I think phrased it that way, and thanks for the question. It's one that I'm not sure I can answer directly, but I can probably share some frameworks to think about it. First of all, this question is on a lot of parents' minds, and there've been also some articles in the news recently in the UAE about this specific question that many families are asking. Two sides to the answer. First of all, we do fundamentally believe that education providers will do whatever it takes to meet health and safety standards and to provide that comfort and communication to families to reassure them. Operators that can't build that trust with their families, you know, they'll probably struggle sort of no matter what, and parents will probably not send their children there anyway, right? So getting health and safety right will be the one single thing that the schools and operators have to get right. And as long as parents have that trust, then operators will obviously have to live up to that as much as they can. But the flip side of that is that because the question is so common, we do fundamentally believe that online schools will become more and more popular. This is something that we have started seeing in the market. In the UAE, this is a new model. There are a lot of virtual schools in countries like America and Australia. In the UAE, this is a new concept, but it starts to be present, and there is at least one licensed fully online school in the country. And we do know for a fact that the inquiries that these operators have started receiving has been spiking up, because parents are considering options. And so we do think that there's going to be a body of parents who will consider, for some time at least, the option of virtual schooling, because that courage sort of isn't there, or that trust isn't there, and that's understandable. So I'm not sure I've given an exact answer around how to find that courage, but hopefully that's a little bit of a framework around how to think about it.
It did indeed. A related question from Khalid, Beatrice. So, do you think that in the future we'll see in Abu Dhabi or in the UAE from regulators probably appetite to license online education providers in terms of like literally providing licenses and have that, as you mentioned, a separate operating model?
Yes, I cannot speak for sort of regulators. What I would say is that this is a trend that has been moving in one very clear direction, which is greater online provision, even for schools over time. And goes without saying, more and more universities globally were starting to provide online courses, including online degrees and masters anyway. This was happening before the pandemic. So the direction was set towards an education world that does more and more online within the constructs of what is regulated. And we don't think that we're going to go backwards. We think that that direction will continue, and the pandemic has just accelerated this process. We do think that there are challenges around the regulation, and in particular quality assurance of online providers. And regulators always need to kind of have the right level of confidence, which comes through frameworks and systems around the fact that if they do license sort of full online providers, be that schools or universities, the quality that is delivered through an online program is as good as an equivalent offline program. And building that confidence into a quality assurance system isn't easy and takes time. So do we think that the world is moving in that direction? Yes. Do we believe that that's something that will be more and more popular here as well? Yes. But how much time will that sort of take to ensure that the quality assurance framework is in place? That we'll have to sort of wait and see.
Fair enough. A question from Philip. What are the three biggest concerns of your clients in the sector, whether they are operators, investors?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think that, well, I'm hoping it is. It's definitely what we've heard, and it definitely should be priority number one, pedagogical continuation. We are sure that all operators and investors behind them have done the absolute impossible to make that happen. Now, what I think is interesting is that it will take some time to show to what extent the learning from a student's point of view may have been affected somewhat. So operators may have done whatever was possible within their own resources and the timelines sort of that they had at hand. But it is possible that some actual learning may have been lost sort of over the last few weeks compared to what a regular academic year would have been like. The data to show what the differential looks like isn't out there yet, right? And I think you will actually start showing in the next academic year. And I think that going forward, that's going to be the priority on the first point for sort of operators, which is sort of just checking what that learning gap may have been and sort of closing that gap to ensuring that the learning journey of any student sort of in the slightly longer term is not affected in any possible shape or form. So number one, absolutely learning continuation. Second of all, it would definitely be sort of finances. We talked about this before. This is obviously sort of something that is relevant to private sector providers, not necessarily relevant for government providers. But some of the challenges that I have mentioned before, in particular around enrollments and securing them. Number two, getting the fee levels right in terms of discounts and cash flow structures that work for them and also work for the parent and the student community. Getting that recipe right isn't easy. And schools and university have been scenario planning, but sort of not everybody will get it right to begin with, potentially in September. So that's definitely something they are definitely talking to us about, sort of seeking advice. And third of all, I would talk about people and talent. Sort of, there's been questions in the last few weeks about retaining talent, having to potentially make considerations about letting people go, sort of pay freezes, recruiting new talent for the next year, right? And a lot of operators, especially in this region, rely quite significantly on talent that comes from abroad, right? So the question around how do you manage your finances, but also first and foremost, ensure that learning continuation through the best possible people is something that definitely clients are talking to us about, and sort of just seeking our point of view around how to best balance the situation.
Thanks for your answer. A question from Prof. Anwar. How urgent is the need for a new education strategy reflecting on the new economical challenges?
I hope I'm speaking on behalf of sort of the team as a whole and not just myself. It's very important and very urgent. Look, I think we're not talking about a change in direction. Thinking about education, not just as schools and universities, but thinking about education as a lifelong journey that is relevant to my kids the same way that they are relevant to me and to you, and to everybody who's on the call, is sort of a mindset shift that was already happening. So hopefully that direction and that strategic direction continues. What I think needs to happen urgently is sort of a very concerted effort to look at what specific initiatives, particularly around skilling, need to be put in place right now. That starts with data around sort of jobs, sectors, sort of specific subsectors that are affected, which ones are starting to show signs of recovery, and sort of really working hard on sort of those data points to start outlining an agenda, both within each individual company, but also at sort of at national level, around what skilling programs, for what skills, for what groups, in what way need to be put in place. And we think that that's going to be a very, very important exercise that we just can't stress enough, how fundamental it's going to be to what recovery will look like.
Thanks for your answer. Another question from Omar. What lessons can be learned from the last recession in terms of education interventions?
That's a great question, and certainly one that has been on our minds. I think, look, different countries dealt with the previous recession in different ways, and of course, we're talking about a very different kind of context. That was sort of a credit crunch. Here, we're talking about sort of a halt has sort of been witnessed by all sectors of the economy. So obviously the context is different, but we can certainly look at some initiatives that were taken back then in the context of learning, and what does that mean for today. I think two big lessons to keep this brief. One is countries that invested in learning and invested in skilling benefited from that. So the results showed. Second of all, not all learning initiatives were done right or paid off. To give you a quick example, and I was talking to Anna about this actually a couple of days ago, what the UK did, for example, was that it went pretty quickly into a deep dive skilling program that then led to developments around sort of apprenticeships within the technical and vocational system, something that is very dear to me, but which we don't have time today. But what then happened is that the kind of the foot was put on the accelerator and then taken back. So, okay, sort of crisis is over, then we can scale back some of the learning initiatives and redeploy sort of this government budget towards other sectors. That doesn't work. So this kind of up and down in terms of investment in education and skilling initiatives is actually quite detrimental. So whilst skilling initiatives should be put in place now to also respond to the current context, they also need to already from today be planned as medium to long-term initiatives, i.e. the moment the tide in certain sectors or more generally starts to turn, one shouldn't move away from this initiative. They shouldn't just be sort of plaster interventions that work now and then they are taken off. And that's one of the biggest lessons learned from the previous recession, where that was done, that then sort of led to consequences later on. So whatever programs are starting now, sort of spurred by the current context, they should really be planned for and committed to unwaveringly for the medium to long term.
Thanks, Beatrice. It's already for one more last question.
Sure.
Are there any particular sectors and or skills that would require or should receive particular attention in terms of skilling over the coming months?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Anna touched like a little bit upon this. I think anything that has to do, and this might sound obvious, but it is just the case, anything that has to do, for example, with data science and sort of technology at large, sort of coding, software engineering, anything that has to also, that can also enable platforms that will enable remote working. That kind of skill that has to do with sort of data and technology undeniably really needs to be invested in sort of in the next few weeks and months. And this is true both for those of us who may not have had that background in our sort of educational journeys in the past, but also it is true for how sort of school and curricula for younger kids need to be sort of thought about. There are other skills which are quite niche but are sort of very dear to us. Information literacy is a super important one. That's sort of individuals' ability to protect themselves against sort of fake news, online scams, and also to just use information in whatever economic sector they may want to go to. And information literacy is something that some really pioneering countries like Singapore, for example, has started integrating into the school curriculum, university programs, as well as lifelong upskilling of employees. Fundamentally, we think that skills that allow individuals, irrespective of the age group, to then move from one sector to another sector throughout their lives are very important. So soft and cognitive skills beyond sort of the traditional technical skills. You know, you study business and then you're kind of stuck in a business role for the rest of your life. That's not what the future looks like.
Thanks, Beatrice. Do you have any final words as a conclusion before I wrap up?
No, look, I think just a final thank you. We think these are all very important questions, and we do sincerely hope that this session has also given the opportunity for everybody who's participating to take these conversations offline within their own organizations. That would be sort of a wish that I have for this session, and I hope that that will happen.
I want to thank you and Anna again for your time over this interesting session. And I want to thank as well everyone for joining us today, and hope you enjoyed the session. Stay tuned for our next week's webinars with Gartner on Sunday, covering top 10 strategic technology trends that organizations need to explore in 2020, and with KPMG on Tuesday, covering what can the UAE consumer and retail businesses do to weather the COVID-19 crisis. Hope to have you all and have a good day. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you.